Margaret. So I want to thank again all our speakers today. And now we're going to have a little bit of fun and bring all our speakers together for a short panel session. I know there are so many questions we want to ask all of them. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover all of them. But we'll do our best to get to some great questions that were submitted prior to the event. And we'll do our best to get all of the other questions answered after the event if we can. So the plan for now is that I am going to be first asking each of the panelists to take a couple of minutes to address a specific question to them. And then we're going to have a little fun and go around the panel with a question for that we will share with all of you. And let's get started with Margaret. And let's see. Some scientific impacts come from attempts to scratch an itch. Others evolve more by chance rather than intentionally. So where the impactful value of an idea sometimes only emerges years or decades after the idea or the technique itself is proposed. What ideas and opportunities might there be today that could have the impact 30 years from now that NSF has had? Recognizing that prediction, of course, is hard, especially about the future. Just to paraphrase Yogi Berra. And how can NSF help increase the likelihood of that impact?
Wonderful question. And obviously the talk I gave just tried to paint parts of that picture. NSF's funding supports core research across all scientific topics. We were founded 70 years ago with that as our mission, to be the nation's basic science and all of science research agency. And within CISE, about 2/3 of our $1 billion a year budget goes to core research programs. So basically good ideas that percolate out of the community, out of individual or small groups of researchers. In addition, good ideas are only, and maybe increasingly, good ideas are only a piece of the puzzle. And we need to make sure that all scientists have access to the data and the resources they need to advance their ideas. And that's where the notion of data repositories and compute resources becomes so important, with the goal being that everyone with a good idea can also find the data, the storage, the software, and the hardware resources to move forward on that idea. In terms of topics, if you want me to pick a winner topic, I'm not going there per se, but I will say that the National Academies just last week released their newest update to the so-called Tire Tracks report that many of us might be familiar with. I would strongly encourage all the listeners to check it out. One of the things that it shows, both graphically and through the text, is the long-term resurgence of topics until they reach impact. And the sort of familiar version example of this is AI, right, with its different summers and winters. But there are other examples that particular diagram, that particular report draws out. For example, the notion of formal methods, which worked for literally decades, getting to the point where now SAT and SMT solvers can be key parts of verifying the security and the reliability of different hardware and software systems. But it took formal methods a while to get to that. That's another decades-long patient investment over time. So resurgence is one thing from the report. The other thing I would note is the degree of confluence, that it's, in many cases, it's about pulling together ideas from different research areas and advancing on them. AI, quantum are all examples where the notion of confluence and the notion of sort of patient investments over time are going to clearly be important going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to take some liberties as the MC and ask the next question for both Dennis and Vint. Let me start by saying, Dennis, you talked about how 35 years ago, there was uncertainty. You also have this memorable quote, "I knew this internet thing would catch on." Okay. As the NSFNet was being created, is there a defining moment in time you can point to that says, if this one thing had not happened, we may not know the internet as we know it today? I like to also ask Mr. Vint, Cerf, to take that question wherever he wants to. I would ask, we know when we heard TCP/IP was instrumental. So maybe if you want to emphasize that, but was there something else also? And again, the defining moment that if that one thing had not happened, we may not know the internet as we know it today. Dennis? There we go. That was a little bit. Well, what we could do is, while we get the microphone back on, Vint, would you like to get us started with this question?
I can certainly try. Am I audible, first of all? It's an important question. Now, whether I make sense is a different question. I understand that. Let me start out by observing that NSF got involved in internet ideas before NSFNet, and the Computer Science Net, or CSNet, started around 1980-81. Discussions were ongoing, and I remember Bob Kahn and Larry Landweber had a conversation, and Bob said, why don't you talk to Vint about TCP/IP? So that NSF had already begun to get some interest in this, and a very successful CSNet was implemented. The second thing is that there were other agencies in the US government that also got into this, and I'm going to have to rely on Dennis to see whether I have the timing right, because the NASA Science Internet and the Energy Sciences Network from NASA and from the Department of Energy were being built in parallel and in replacement of earlier networks. For example, there was a high performance physics network, HEPNet, a high energy physics network that was based on Digital Equipment Corporation's DECnet. And that was a DOE activity. If I remember right, NASA was also using digital equipment. And so there was quite a tussle over whether to stick with the DECnet path or whether to switch over to this TCP/IP thing. And digital was going in the OSI direction. So there was quite a bit of tension in those 1980s periods over which direction to go. There were government policies that required everybody to use OSI because that was being established by an international standards organization. And, you know, who is this? What is this IETF thing? It's just part of the Defense Department. And, you know, who wants to use that? So there was a lot of tension there. I think, though, that one of the key implementation practices for TCP/IP was the implementation of that protocol for Unix operating system. It was done at Berkeley, and it was released as BSD 4.2. And that was made available free of charge. DARPA paid for that. And on that, plus the introduction in the early 1980s of Ethernet, and then the Sun Microsystems workstations, which adopted the use of TCP/IP in part because of the Berkeley Unix implementation. All of that was going on sort of in parallel. And so although I'm not sure that we would have seen quite the same rapid evolution of the internet had Dennis not made his decision. There was an ongoing initiative using these protocols, but I think the NSFNet decision really accelerated that. In particular, the multi-network architecture that was chosen for NSFNet backbone plus the intermediate level networks instantly demonstrated the feasibility of a multi-network, very distributed environment. Do we have audio back now from Dennis?
I have audio. The technical background people have been working frantically to fix me, and I managed to get my earphones and Bluetooth and everything confused. So much for the technology. But I was just about to answer the question, Anna, because there are a couple of things that come to mind. I think Vint is right that in the long term, the obvious open systems, the open nature of the TCP/IP protocols, the network of network concepts, the availability in the computer science world would have brought the internet into fruition. but it might have been a long time. So, for example, had the OSI protocols been more advanced, because one of my things was that I said, yeah, OSI, fine. When these international standards do emerge, when they do really exist, and they didn't in 1985, and when in particular they provide connectionless services and they work and are available, then in about 5 years' time, we'll consider it. Of course, that never happened. I mean, ISO International Standards, OSI, was a complete cluster blank. It really was, and I was involved in it on the European side, but I won't go there. The specific question. Well, I suppose if there were a different program director hired at that time, things might have been different. I had a background in networking. I knew that Larry Landweber and Ira Fuchs were the people who encouraged me to come to the US. So I was steeped in the idea of open networking and TCP/IP and so on. Another program director might not have been. And there was significant pressure to be pragmatic. Look, Dennis, I know this network of networks, but if we have this network here and that network there and this network there, isn't that a network of networks? No, that's not a network of networks. So they're a different type of program director, and program directors have enormous autonomy. I mean, I did stuff that I didn't have to ask anyone's permission for, because I thought it was the right thing and I thought it was my job. A different program director might have done differently. And a very specific, about a week before I left at the end of my 15 months, I went up to Princeton to the John von Neumann Center to talk to them. And I learned, to my horror and shock, they were planning to run DECnet on the JVNC network. Now, the JVNC network it was a T1 network. It really was the backbone, while the little 56 KB backbone was kind of weak. It was really important to the NSFNet program. But the engineers they brought in from ETA, the supercomputing people, knew DECnet. They liked DECnet. They knew nothing about TCP/IP, so they were going to run DECnet. And I said, you can't do that. And they said, well, why not? I said, because that fellow in the NSF has said it has to be TCP/IP. If it's part of the NSFNet program and it's been funded by NSFNet, it has to be TCP/IP. So, but for that tiny little happenstance, the effort might simply have not worked.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you. That's not serendipitous, but que sera, sera, as some people may say. That's great. Let's take now to Andrew. The Internet Society has considerable resources at its disposal. Can you describe how you hope to use those resources in the coming decades to champion the things that we love about the Internet? And you can expand on those things that we don't love about the Internet, but let's be positive, very positive today too. But what can you share with us that we can hold ISOC to account for in the coming decades?
Well, there are a couple of straightforward things that I can point out. The first one is that today, in fact, we released our plans for next year. So our annual plan that's up on the website. And so, those are the kinds of things that you can hold us to account for right away. We've also made a significant announcement recently about relatively long-term funding for the Internet Engineering Task Force in order to make sure that the IETF is there over the long haul. And there's a matching program involved there so that, as the IETF expands its own fundraising capabilities, they get some money from the Internet Society as well in order to make sure that they're on a solid footing over the long run. But there's another piece to this that I think is important, and it was just very nicely illustrated both by Vint and Dennis, in that the sort of engineering decisions are and deployment decisions are kind of bound up with one another in important ways a lot of the time. That it's not just enough to sort of say, oh, well, now we've invented this protocol or now we've done the science or whatever. You also have to, get things deployed, get things in the field. And the reality is that it's still the case, despite all of the celebration that we're having today, it is still the case that nearly half of the world's population doesn't have access to this marvelous tool. And that's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's one of the things that we are, passionately committed to. We're working with others in order to improve access. We're working with governments and regulators in order to make the regulatory environment easy so that different mechanisms will work. We're working with all sorts of different approaches to connectivity, because the sort of standard approaches that we've taken to everything, they've worked well for half the world, and we've got to figure out how to connect everybody else. And as that is successful, it's not enough just to connect people. It's not enough to sort of drop the internet on people. They need to know what to do with it, how to work with it, how to use it, how to take advantage of the opportunities that it presents. It's not enough to, go into a country and say, poof, now you've interneted. You really have to give people the tools and the ability and the skills in order to do those things. And I think that is one of the critical things that we are investing in, to try to make sure that everybody in the world can use the tools to the advantage of themselves and not to the advantages of a few who, already have plenty.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's take now to Howard. Internet 2 owes a lot to its creation, to all that happened 35 years ago. And then came the internet. Today, Internet 2, our name includes the internet, and we're still called Internet 2. So as the NREN for the United States, can you share with the audience what's next for Internet 2? What are you most excited about that you want to share with us today?
Well, I won't take the bait either. I won't pick favorites. I'm excited about all the things that we're doing. I think many things that I mentioned. But I will say one of the things I'm sort of very excited about is for taking a more holistic approach, is how do we use all our capabilities to help scale and accelerate research and education collaborations across the community. And this year has certainly shown how important those collaborations are, maybe more so than ever before. And so, but in the context of this event, talking about scientific collaborations, we're certainly in a much different place than where we were back then with 5 national centers. As we talked about, data analytics, this growing ecosystem of computational ecosystems, much more heterogeneous than we saw that with ECAS. Researchers using specific elements like FPGAs in a commercial cloud, and GPUs in another one, to optimize parts of an existing scientific workflow to get an overall improvement. Composing that, has been a real focus. I think that, that there's a huge value in that, huge opportunity, but it also comes along with a lot of engineering and technical challenges. It's more complex, many more things to put together. Technology changes at an extreme rate. And, there's still a lot of manual effort in putting in a complete end-to-end solution for across the board. And the days of a single researcher understanding the whole system end-to-end are long gone. There's so many different moving parts. So, I think for us, what's next is much more of a focus when it comes to the networking piece on the software elements of the networking, and really tying that together with the trust model, so that we can make the idea of a national, research cloud as frictionless as possible, and making it much easier for people to do it. I think that's also part of the democratization part. Following the theme here is, if you're going to make the infrastructure much more available to researchers and many more researchers, you also have to make it easier for people to use to get the effect out of it. I think one of the advantages that the R&D network community has is this unique collaboration, spirit of collaboration that we have. If you're really trying to do things edge to edge, there's things that the R&D network community can do between campuses, regionals, national, NRANs, international NRANs, government agency networks that that we can do end to end because we have that shared mission that doing, maybe in a more traditional networking world would be difficult to achieve.
Thank you.
Just said. That end-to-end notion also drives the importance of transborder data flow and the freedom of movement of traffic back and forth to accelerate research. And the other thing is that the International Connections Program and the relationships among the various national research and education networks that NSF funds has been super helpful, not only in getting these large-scale high-performance networks linked to each other, but what's interesting is that they also extend outward from the universities where those the nexus is into the local population. And so we're starting to see organizations like the Network Startup Resource Center, which is also funded by NSF, reaching out to schools, which right now are isolated because of the pandemic. And so the existence of the NREMs is actually creating a new opportunity to extend access.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Vint. And thanks for the call out to our colleagues at NSRC and the great work that they're doing as well for global democratization and access to the internet. And speaking of the internet, so you all touched on this, and I wish I didn't have to bring it up, but we live in a global pandemic today. And all the work that you've all been talking about have enabled us now with the internet to continue some level of functioning during a very difficult time for our societies. The internet has become a key to economic survival and communications in a world without face-to-face interactions. Can you expand a little bit more on the things that you would like to bring up in terms of the advances that have allowed this capability? Feel free to also talk about additional challenges that you would like to call out that have surfaced, or what lessons have we learned over the last couple of months or last several months that will drive future research and innovation? I'm going to ask each of you, and let's go in the same order as I ask you the questions. Take 1 minute, if you can, to answer that question. But Margaret, I made you go first, so I will give you an out if you want to go last, too. So what would you prefer? Would you want to go first?
I think I'm happy to go first before all the good ideas are taken, right? So I'm going to leave all the networking stuff for the networking experts. I'm going to talk about processors and graphics, right? So the fact that we are able to be here today is in part based on networking and bandwidth, but it's also based on graphics processors that are keeping up with us as we speak. It's based on natural language processing that's able to do a half-decent job of captioning this so that a broad set of people can view this in an accessible way. So I'll stay there. NLP and processors and graphics processors, and I'll leave the rest for the other four. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
It's Vint again. Look, 3 words: drive cost out. The only way that we're going to make this system accessible to everybody is if we make it affordable at capacities that make it useful, as we are seeing right now. So driving cost out is super important. There are policy issues there. There are technology issues there. There are business model issues there, all of which will contribute to getting the other half of the world up and running in a useful way.
Jennings.
I think we've seen a glimpse of a possible future that is interesting and appealing, and that is using technology to make the isolated farmhouse in rural Ireland as central to the activities, economic and social, as an apartment in the middle of the city of Dublin, where I'm in at the moment. It's going to need a lot more technology, a lot more computing power, a lot more realism in the interactions, so that we can all interact. But it would also eliminate a lot of the bottlenecks in cities. It would eliminate a lot of the commute. People are now spending 2 hours getting to work and 2 hours getting home on top of a 7.5-hour day or whatever it is. That's an awful nightmare for the civilized world. And for the rest of the world, which isn't based on cities or small rural populations, as Andrew pointed out, they don't have access to this technology. So somewhere in there is a glimmer of a continuation of this change into a much more equal world that doesn't have burning fossil fuels to get to work and burning half our waking lives to go and come back from work. And that, I think, is an idea that should inspire us.
Okay.
I'll go. I think, I'm guilty as anybody, to take a network-centric view of things and talk about how, the network only covers half the people on the planet. But I think we also have to consider that, probably more than that don't have devices to actually use the network. And I think if you're going to, we have to consider the full, solution for allowing people to interact, collaborate, and take advantage of the amazing compute and technology infrastructure that we have, including the training elements that come along with that. I think we're just, the network is certainly an important piece, but it's not the only piece.
Andrew.
Well, I will say that I am, desperately looking forward to the period in which I can get a haircut over the internet. But quite apart from that, I think that we have the fundamental reality that we've been taught here is the ways in which we can adapt. We are tool using creatures, humans are, and it means that we've got this tool, and we don't know what people are going to do with it. And I think that preserving that flexibility of this technology is one of the things that I think we're really going to have to concentrate on, because it's very tempting to say, okay, well, we know what this thing's for now, and we're going to set it up so that that's what we can do with it. I think we need to make sure that as the other half of the world comes online, they're going to notice that we can do interesting things with it. Let's make sure that they have those opportunities.
Great. Thank you. I know we're a little past time, but I'm going to ask you to just stay for a few more minutes to just take one more question that I think is really important. Let me ask the question and then see if each of you would want to take less than a minute to answer this one. If you look back to the younger version of yourself 35 years ago, when you were setting out to change the world, knowing what you've learned and knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to the younger generation of professionals today?
Oh, wow.
Let's start with you, Dan.
From my perspective, if I'd known where we'd end up when I started NSFNet, I probably would have been frozen in the headlights. I would have had to think about, well, what about a scalable network that covers all the world? Not just for research, but for commerce. What about security? What about bad actors? What about this? It would be overwhelming. But I was fortunate enough to be dealing with a small community and some simple ideas and to stick to those. So what advice would I give? Don't overthink it. Get some good stuff done. And then let's see what happens. Would be my advice.
Great. Thank you. Howard, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, first of all, 35 years ago, I wasn't that young. But with that context, the first thing I think I'd tell people is go out and go change the world. Right? I think that's a critical part of if you're going to spend a good part of your life doing something, do something, that you're going to have an impact, and everybody can have an impact. I think the other thing is, don't worry about failure. Don't worry about making mistakes. That is, usually in the long run, your best friend. Short term may be painful, but, take chances, and don't think too far in the future of what it's all going to mean. Don't worry about, people always say, go outside your comfort zone. For me, that's easy. I'm never comfortable, so I'm always outside my comfort zone. But, do things that, you're that are unexpected, especially when you're younger and you have that time. That's what I've got advice to give you.
Thank you. Margaret.
My advice would be, we need you. We need all of you. I think our field sometimes gives the impression that you have to have been playing with this technology from preschool to the present in order to be eligible to come in the door. And I think that's a problem. We need everyone because it's through that broad diversity of ideas that we're going to tackle those next themes that all of us mentioned about the way that computers touch humanity. We can't do that without pulling in a broader cross-section of humanity to work on those challenges. So we need you all. Thanks.
Andrew.
Well, I mean, that's a great segue because 35 years ago, I still thought I was going to be a philosophy professor. And look what happened. I think it's actually really important to recognize that the perspectives that different people bring to this, to this effort is exactly what brings us new ideas to it. And without those injections of things that you weren't expecting, you're not going to get the advantages, whether it's the thing that you're not going to be expecting because, as Dennis described, you managed to buttonhole enough people at the conference so that you convinced them that actually the network was a good idea, or whether it's because, you get this sort of kismet where you discover that somebody's going to deploy DECnet and that's a bad idea, or whatever it is. Those opportunities are something that we need to be prepared to do, and for that, we have to have lots of people.
Great. Vint.
So several things. First of all, young people are usually too young to know you can't do that, and so I encourage them to go try anyway. Second, if you're young, take the risky road because you're young enough to recover from all this stuff. And I guess the final observation, which might be in some distinction to what Howard said, you don't have to go out to change the world. Just go out and do something. You'll be surprised what happens if it works.